Hello, I thought it was time that I took a look at another of Eliot's poems, or groups of poems, a group of poems, Four Quartets. This is generally considered to be his last masterpiece, and some people think it's the best thing he ever did. In my opinion, it's probably not up to the standard of his greatest earlier work. However, it does include a lot of fine poetry, and certainly indicates the arc of Eliot's thinking and his life, and how he eventually became a Christian, and the process, and what his Christianity meant to him. All these questions are important for the student of Eliot, and can't really go to a better place than Four Quartets to see the fulfillment of Eliot's poetic realization as a Christian. As I say, it's not perhaps, I keep saying it, I should really say they, but I'm really concerned with BURNT NORTON, the first poem in the quartet of poems today, and so that really is an it. It is not as full of great poetry as some of the best of his earlier work. It's very abstract and very abstruse at times. Long passages are very dry. However, it does have some fine poetic moments and some interesting concepts which have sort of come into popular consciousness, I suppose. There is the idea of later on he talks about the still point of the turning world, and this is something by Eliot that most people know about, his concept of the still point of the turning world. And he begins with an examination of time. Time past and time present is perhaps present in time future, perhaps contained in time future. So this is something to get our teeth into, and it does have its memorable phrases. Another one would be about humanity not being able to bear much reality. People cannot bear much reality. So it does have its moments, even if long tracts of this poem are a bit dry. We have to realize that Eliot hadn't really produced much poetry of a high quality for a long time when he wrote Four Quartets. At the time, he was writing Murder in the Cathedral, and some of the discarded parts of Murder in the Cathedral actually find their way into this poem. Eliot was never one to waste his poetic production, and indeed he didn't really write enough to be able to waste things that were good that he produced, so he found another home for them. The whole structure is fairly diffuse, as Eliot so often is. These fragments I have showed against my ruin. And his modus operandi is often to just create a long poem out of a lot of bits and pieces, really, fragments. And I feel that he probably wrote a lot of bridging sections here to connect them all together, and perhaps that's similar to what he did in the Wasteland, but it was more effective in the Wasteland and less effective here. Probably less padding, less bridging passages in the Wasteland, whereas here you feel there are long sections which don't have much inspiration, which are just really there to connect things together. So the poem was originally written when Eliot visited the the house in the Cotswolds, BURNT NORTON, with his friend Emily Hale, who at the time seemed likely to become the next Mrs. Eliot. And Eliot's poem is inspired more by the garden than the house itself. And he was a Christian by this time, so he was particularly interested in ideas of time and what the relationship was of the past, present, and future to God's plan for human salvation. So that's really what the poem is about. So I tried actually having Eliot read the poem here, and it came out indecipherable. So what I'm going to do now is just read some parts of the poem rather than let Eliot read all of it. So let me bring it up if I can. Okay. Right, so it begins in a very famous way. Some of the most famous lines are those at the start. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. So the present and the past are together in time future, and time future contained in the past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. So it's all one, basically. The past is present in the future is present in the past, and it's all according to God's design. And we might perceive it as past, present, and future, but in God's plan of destiny for human beings, it's all just part of one greater whole, which is revealing his plan. I suppose it's something like that. But all time is unredeemable because human beings are a part of that plan and largely cannot change it. What might have been is an abstraction. Remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. So I suppose Eliot would believe that there was people that had some free will and were able to change God's plan according to their actions, at least in a small way. So these are interesting points, really, whether God has eternal plan for man, which man is just a part of and thinks that he exercises free will, or does he really exercise free will and change God's plan? Well, he will not change God's plan in Eliot's eyes, but there might be some wiggle room, as they say. There might be some possibilities for changing things in a small way. But this is all from Eliot's Christian point of view anyway, ideas about time related to God's eternal plan of salvation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. So what might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. This is interesting. So the past and ideas about how the past could have been different are only actually here in the present because it's finished. So it's only in people's memories that they can think about how the past could have been different or how the past was. So beyond the memories of people, such speculation is meaningless. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened. into the rose garden. My words echo. So, my words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. So, it's all finished now, it's over. What's the point of dredging up the past? What's the point of talking about it? Things might have been different, but they aren't, and they weren't, and it's all in the past now, and just memories, which is the only place that these things can exist. So this is quite nice, this beginning. It's poetic as well as quite technical in terms of Eliot's view of how God's plan is for man. I won't continue because it starts to get very, very unpoetic, really. It's not poetry. It seems to be just prose a lot of the time, which is explaining technical matters. So I would say that there is too much of this kind of material in the poem, kind of connecting material. Perhaps Eliot had a lot of material from the play he was writing, Murder in the Cathedral, from one or two other poems, and he wanted to put them all together, and he thought he could add one or two nice new parts. And it was a method of working which was very congenial to Eliot, but it didn't work as well here as it did in The Wasteland. Perhaps he had less material and had to write more connecting stuff than in The Wasteland, but it's very, very dry, a lot of this poem. Very dry indeed. Just trying to find another section that's important and relevant and well known. There's a section about the still point of the turning world. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is. So this is an important concept, of course, because you can use it's poetic and you can use it as a metaphor at the same time. It's very easy to use it as a metaphor. So the turning wheel has still point at the center, and yet the wheel would not be turning without the still point. So it's easy to use that as a metaphor for God. God is a still point in the center, and everything else depends on him, the movement, what's happening, past, present, and future. Everything depends on God. So, yeah, this is not a unique idea to Eliot, but it's a nice metaphor to use to express what he means. So without the still point, there would be no dance. A lot of it gets a bit repetitive, so I won't read it all. It may seem like a heresy to say that some of Eliot is repetitive. However, it's only my opinion, and if you think something different, then of course I appreciate that. But to me, a lot of this is just not great poetry. I feel that he was in something of a writer's block at the time he wrote the poem. and he was glad to use some of the good parts from other places, other works like Murder in the Cathedral and other poems, and try to put them all together and give them relevance by writing connecting sections, and he would create a poem that way and get out of his writer's block. Originally, there was no idea that this poem would be part of a quartet, and Burnt Norton was a standalone poem, but probably from the poetic title and the theme of past, present, and future, Eliot began to see this as a theme that he could write a series of poems on, specifically about the arc of his own intellectual and religious development in life, from kind of agnosticism to Christian faith. And he could do that by examining the history of his family in England and where they came from and how they went to the United States, and he came back, and in the end is my beginning, and so on and so forth. And it makes a nice theme and nice project, this kind of project that Eliot liked, where he could have this overarching theme and then fit all the bits and pieces into it. It's not too tight or restricting a theme. Some of the poetry in the later quartets is excellent. I think the next one, East Coker, is the best poem from the point of view of poetry. That's the one where he talks about the nature of dying and death, and oh, dark, 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 we all go into the dark. And that is far better, actually, than Burnt Norton. Burnt Norton was originally based on a trip to the house in the Cotswolds, famous house in the Cotswolds, where with his friend Emily Hale, who seemed likely to become his wife at the time, but didn't, because Eliot kind of backed out. And most of the poem is based on themes that come up in the garden of the house. And I can imagine that the poetic name of the place, Burnt Norton, suggested to Eliot that he could write a series of poems, and each one would have a poetic name based on place, like the village where his family came from, and things like this. So the poem then, in my opinion, is not as good as the best of earlier Eliot, although there are some very good sections in it. And most people know that line from the poem about people cannot bear much reality. But the way it occurs, it kind of pops out and doesn't seem to have much relevance to what came before or after. So it has that typical Eliot fragmentary quality. So I would say it's a good poem by anybody else's standards, but by Eliot's own standards, he had set the bar so high that it's not up to the level of the best of his earlier work. However, the next poem, East Coker, from a poetic point of view, probably is. Overall, though, the four quartets taken as a group of four poems, I think you cannot say that they are at the same level as the best of Eliot's earlier work, although some people say they are and say they're even better, that they represent his masterpiece his greatest work, poetic work. Such people are usually influenced by the theme and the topic, and perhaps the ideas which Eliot are expressing on God and salvation, the place of man in the world, are themes which are important to them as well, or areas where they agree with Eliot, and this influences poetic judgment. So that's what I really have to say about this poem. Just to read a little bit more here. Words move, music moves, only in time. But that which is only living can only die. Words after speech reach into the silence. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness, as a Chinese jar still moves perpetually its stillness, perpetually in this stillness, sorry. So this is fine poetry here, and I'm not saying that there isn't any good poetry in it, but obviously I'm reading some of the better sections here. There are areas of the poem which are full of dense bridging passages, really. Not the stillness of the violin while the note lasts. No, not that only, but the coexistence, or say that the end precedes the beginning, and that the end and the beginning were always there, before the beginning and after the end, and all is always now. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden. So yeah, this is good. The section about language. I'm sorry I can't actually see some of the words very well, so that explains why I'm stumbling over some of them. So this is a good example of the way the poet struggles with words, or anybody who's writing really struggles with words. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place. So this is a good way of describing the struggle with words and how the meanings of words keep changing. So what you think, a meaning that you think a word has, it ceases to have, acquires a new one. Maybe gay would be an example, not that he uses it here, but there are many poets who use the word gay to simply mean happy and joyous, whereas now it's taken on a different meaning. So it may include that still, but it will bring other thoughts into someone's mind as well. So this is just an example that occurs to me, but the English language is full of words like this where the meanings are changing. So this is something for the writer to think about, the way in which his words are not fixed, or the meanings of the words are not fixed. They will change in the future. So just scrolling a little bit to see if I can find anything else. Yeah, I think we can leave it there, really. So, a fine poem in its way, and it has some great sections, some interesting ideas about time, the nature of man's place in the universe. However, you're inevitably going to like this more if you agree with Eliot about man's place in the scheme of things. It's a very different Eliot to the one of the Wasteland and earlier poems, where there's a lot of sarcasm, a lot of irony from the point of view of reading a writer. It's probably more interesting because he seems to have many sides to his personality, whereas here it's much more the person who knows imparting his knowledge to the person listening. No satire, no sarcasm, no irony. And these are the qualities I miss in Four Quartets that were present in Eliot's earlier poetry. So I hope that's useful, and I hope to do something on BURNT NORTON in the future. Sorry, something on East Coker in the future, which is, in my opinion, a far better poem than this one. Thank you.